Should I sell my rental house tenant occupied? So you have a tenant in your rental house and you decide you want to sell the property. So should you do it while the property is tenant occupied? And I know what you're thinking. If I sell the house while it's occupied, I'll have no interruption in income, and then boom, I'll have my sales proceeds when the property sells. But wait, there's a lot more to consider that you may not have already considered. Hi, my name is Steve Schultz with Blue Fox Properties here in Tucson, Arizona. We specialize in managing rental houses, and we've been doing so since 2009. Let's take a look at the advantages and the disadvantages. So first off, advantages. So the first advantage is, the thought process goes, is there will be little or no vacancy. So you will have no loss of your monthly revenue stream. So that's the first thought. And then because there will be no vacancy, or very little vacancy, you won't have that danger of squatters, vandals, not seeing maintenance issues because the property is vacant. So those are really the two biggest advantages that most people think about. But now let's talk about the disadvantages. So first of all, let's talk about marketing the property. One of the things you're going to need to consider is, because the property is occupied by a tenant, is the property in show-ready condition every time a prospective buyer goes to take a look? In our experience, usually not. Next is, how do you handle marketing photos so the tenant's belongings aren't included? So this is a legitimate concern for tenants when you are in the property taking marketing photos, or a photographer is in the property doing that, and they're going to have a photo of their big screen TV now publicized to the world that's in this property. And so they have concerns. They're like, hey, wait a minute. I don't want the whole world to know that I have this big giant TV in my house that maybe somebody decides they want to steal, right? So marketing the property can be an issue, and are you set up and prepared to handle that? The next question is, will the tenant cooperate with the process? So you got to remember that their cooperation will ultimately result in them having to move. So they're disincentivized right off the bat. Like, why should I cooperate with this process when it's going to force me to move, right? So that's something to be aware of. The next thing is the need to provide legal notice for showing. So did you know that the penalty for not doing so is 1 month of rent for each time proper legal notice isn't provided? And that's per Arizona Revised Statute 13-1376B, if you want to check it out and look at it. So you got to make sure you're giving them proper legal notice. And by the way, what is proper legal notice, right? And what does that mean? And have you allowed the time frame that's required to do that? Another concern when the tenant is in the property is maybe a showing is going on and they're trying to convince the buyer what a crummy property this is, right? You shouldn't buy this thing, it's a mess, it has all kinds of maintenance issues, right? Whatever may be the case, something to be concerned about there as well. And then how do you coordinate the showings, right? So again, not only are you going to have to give proper legal notice, but you're going to have to establish those times of when the showings can be done and give that proper legal notice and that whole process. The next thing is, how do you handle showings if the tenant has pets? So again, are they cooperating? Are they putting the pets out in the yard or putting them in the kennel or whatever may be the case, so that that prospective buyer can see the property without being hassled by the pet? And then how do you handle the inspections once the buying process proceeds? So the home inspection, the roof inspection, the HVAC inspection, all those types of things are also going to need to be coordinated and proper legal notice given. So next, let's talk about who would buy a tenant-occupied house anyway, right? Well, who's gonna buy this? It's typically gonna not be an owner-occupant, because an owner-occupant is going to want to move into the property right away, because that's why they're buying the house, right? Because they plan to live there. So it's typically not gonna be them. Again, depending on the timing, in theory, it could be, but a lot of times these sales are happening mid-lease, so that's not a possibility. So who does that leave? That leaves the investor buyer. Now, what is the issue with an investor buyer? Well, one, they're not willing to pay as much, because why? Well, because they're an investor, right? They're looking for a deal. So they're not going to be willing to pay as much. And also, they're a smaller part of the buyer pool. So if the entire market is this much of owner occupants as well as those investor buyers, maybe the investor buyers are only this much. So smaller market, longer days on market, all types of things that can happen as a result of that. So after it's all said and done, selling a tenant-occupied property is actually very problematic, and it will almost always result in a smaller financial gain than what would have otherwise been possible. So we definitely recommend for you, wait until the house is vacant. That's how you can maximize your profits from that house. I hope you found this video helpful. Subscribe below for more landlord tips like this.